You are standing in a medieval town that did not plan to exist as it does now. The streets beneath your feet are narrow, not because people liked them that way, but because space was once a luxury no one expected to last. The rules that govern how you walk, trade, sleep, and even dispose of waste were not carefully designed by thoughtful planners. They were reactions. They were emergency responses made during moments when survival mattered more than elegance or fairness. What is easy to forget, especially from a modern distance, is that many of these decisions were never meant to last. In the medieval world, emergencies were not rare events. They were the rhythm of life. Famine, fire, flood, disease, war, and sudden population shifts arrived with little warning. There was no central authority prepared to manage them in advance. Instead, towns reacted quickly, often clumsily, creating rules that were announced aloud in marketplaces, nailed to church doors, or passed by word of mouth. These rules were meant to solve immediate problems, yet many of them remained long after the crisis faded, quietly becoming part of daily life. To understand how this happened, you need to imagine how fragile medieval systems really were. A town might depend on a single grain supply, a single bridge, or one freshwater source. If that failed, people did not debate philosophy. They acted. Councils met in haste. Lords issued commands. Church authorities offered guidance that mixed spiritual belief with practical control. What mattered was restoring order quickly, even if the solution was imperfect. One of the clearest examples of emergency becoming routine can be found in how medieval towns controlled movement. During times of unrest or danger, gates were closed early, guards were posted, bells rang at sunset to warn people to return home. This was not originally about safety in the modern sense. It was about control. Darkness meant anonymity, and anonymity meant risk. When famine struck or rumors of rebellion spread, officials needed to know where people were. At first, these measures were temporary. A town under threat would lock down for weeks or months. Once the danger passed, the gates were expected to reopen as before. But something subtle happened. People adjusted their habits. Merchants planned their days around closing times. Families structured meals earlier. Night activity decreased. Over time, what began as an emergency precaution felt normal. When someone suggested removing the restriction, it no longer felt like a return to freedom. It felt like chaos. The same pattern appears in sanitation. Medieval towns were not ignorant of hygiene. They understood that waste caused sickness, even if they did not know why. During outbreaks of disease, emergency rules were imposed. Waste had to be dumped outside the walls. Certain streets were cleaned more often. Animals were banned from crowded areas. These measures were difficult and unpopular. Carrying waste farther took time. Cleaning streets required labor. But when disease receded, officials noticed something important. Towns that kept these rules suffered fewer deaths. The next time illness appeared, what began as a temporary health response slowly hardened into expectation. New generations grew up, assuming that waste belonged outside the living space. Streets began to be designed with drainage in mind. These were not planned reforms. They were habits that formed because emergency rules stayed in place just long enough to feel familiar. You can see the same process in medieval food control. During famine, authorities fixed prices. Bakers were told exactly how much bread should weigh and how much it should cost. Inspectors were appointed to enforce these rules. At first, this was done to prevent unrest. Hungry people were dangerous. Bread riots were common. Keeping food affordable was a way to maintain peace. Once the famine passed, removing price controls proved harder than expected. People had grown used to the idea that bread had a fair price set by authority. Bakers, too, found stability in predictable rules. Over time, what was meant as emergency protection evolved into long-lasting regulation. Medieval bread laws became some of the earliest consumer protection systems in history. These changes did not feel revolutionary at the time. They felt dull. Meetings were held. Complaints were recorded. Fines were issued. Life continued. That is why these moments are often overlooked. They were not dramatic turning points marked by speeches or celebrations. They were quiet adjustments made by tired people trying to prevent the worst outcomes. You can imagine a town council sitting on wooden benches, listening to reports of illness or theft. Someone suggests extending a temporary rule, just a little longer. Another person agrees, saying it is safer this way. No one writes that this decision will shape centuries of urban life. No one knows that future societies will inherit these habits and assume they were always meant to exist. Another area, where emergency responses became permanent, is labor control. During population shortages, caused by plague or war, authorities fixed wages. Workers were forbidden to demand higher pay. Movement between towns was restricted to prevent labor shortages from spreading. These laws were deeply unpopular, but they were enforced during crisis. When stability returned, employers and rulers found these controls convenient. Limiting worker mobility preserved social order. Wage regulation prevented sudden economic shifts. Over time, what began as a temporary freeze on labor conditions shaped class structures that lasted generations. Even religious practices were influenced by emergency measures. During periods of unrest or fear, churches adjusted schedules, public gatherings were limited or redirected. Processions were controlled to prevent crowds from becoming unpredictable. Once people adapted to these changes, they often remained, not because they were spiritually necessary, but because they fit the new rhythm of life. What you begin to see is a pattern. Emergencies create rules. Rules create habits. Habits become tradition. Tradition hardens into structure. By the time anyone questions why a rule exists, the original emergency has been forgotten. Medieval people did not think of themselves as living through the invention of modern systems. They thought they were surviving. Their decisions were reactive, practical, and often deeply conservative. They preferred known restrictions to unknown freedoms. Stability mattered more than fairness. Predictability mattered more than innovation. This explains why so many medieval emergency measures feel strangely familiar today. Fixed working hours, controlled food standards, urban planning shaped by disease prevention, surveillance born from fear of unrest. None of these began as thoughtful designs for a better society. They were answers to immediate problems that never fully went away. As you listen to this history, you are not hearing the story of progress. You are hearing the story of endurance. People accepted limits because limits reduced risk. Over time, those limits stopped feeling like emergency tools and started feeling like the natural order of things. And this raises an important question that lingers at the edge of this story. How many of the rules you live with now were once meant to be temporary, created during moments of fear or crisis, and never questioned again once the danger passed? By the time an emergency rule settled into routine, medieval people rarely remembered why it existed in the first place. You would have grown up inside it. Your parents would have followed it without question. The rule would feel less like a decision, and more like a feature of the world, as natural as the sound of church bells or the uneven stones beneath your feet. This is how temporary control slowly transformed into invisible structure. To understand how deeply this process worked, you need to step inside the everyday experience of a medieval town after the initial crisis had faded. The danger might be gone, but the memory of it lingered. Fear does not vanish quickly. It leaves traces in behavior, language, and expectations. Authorities understood this instinctively. They learned that it was easier to keep a rule than to remove it, especially if people believed it protected them. Consider the night watch. During periods of unrest, towns appointed extra guards. These men walked the streets after sunset, calling out the hours, checking doors, watching for fire or theft. At first, this was an emergency measure, usually introduced after riots, invasions, or waves of crime driven by hunger. The watch was expensive. Someone had to pay the guards. Equipment had to be maintained. Complaints were common. But once the watch existed, it changed how people felt about the night. Darkness became something monitored rather than endured. People slept more easily knowing someone was awake. Merchants felt safer storing goods. Even criminals adjusted their behavior, moving elsewhere or changing tactics. Over time, removing the watch felt reckless. What if trouble returned? What if fire broke out unnoticed? What if thieves came back? The emergency watch became a permanent institution, and eventually the foundation of organized policing. You see a similar pattern in record keeping. Many medieval towns did not maintain detailed written records until disaster forced them to. Fires destroyed property. Floods erased boundaries. Wars displaced families. In response, authorities began documenting ownership, debts, and obligations more carefully. At first, these records were created to resolve specific disputes caused by chaos. Once written records existed, they created a new kind of power. Officials could reference them. Disagreements could be settled with parchment instead of memory. Over time, people came to rely on written proof rather than personal testimony. What began as a response to disorder became bureaucracy. Town clerks gained importance. Archives grew. The habit of writing things down reshaped governance itself. Emergency taxes follow the same path. War demanded money quickly. Rulers imposed temporary levies, promising they would end once the threat passed. People grumbled but paid, understanding that survival required sacrifice. When peace returned, the financial machinery did not disappear. Officials realized how effective these systems were. The infrastructure for collection already existed. Removing the tax would require effort. An effort without immediate benefit was rarely attractive. Gradually, temporary taxes were renamed, adjusted, justified. They were no longer described as emergency measures, but as necessary contributions to stability. People adapted. They budgeted around them. Over generations, few remembered that the tax had once been introduced as a short-term response to danger. Housing rules provide another quiet example. After fires or epidemics, towns often imposed building regulations. Roof materials were restricted. Certain layouts were discouraged. Spacing between structures was enforced. These rules were deeply practical. Fire spread quickly through dense wooden buildings. Disease thrived in cramped quarters. Once rebuilding occurred under these rules, the town itself changed shape. Streets widened slightly. Stone replaced wood in key areas. New neighborhoods reflected emergency standards rather than older habits. Future construction followed the same patterns, not because danger was immediate, but because the existing environment demanded consistency. Emergency architecture became urban identity. Even social behavior was reshaped by crisis routines. During periods of fear, public gatherings were restricted. Taverns closed earlier. Markets were supervised. Loud celebrations were discouraged. People learned to be quieter, more cautious. Children were raised in households where restraint was praised as wisdom. When the danger faded, not everyone rushed to reclaim older freedoms. Some found comfort in order. Predictable schedules reduced anxiety. Controlled spaces felt safer than open ones. Over time, communities internalized these behaviors. Self-regulation replaced external enforcement. What began as imposed discipline became cultural norm. This process did not require cruelty or conspiracy. It relied on exhaustion. Medieval life was hard. People were tired of instability. If a rule promised even the illusion of safety, it was often welcomed. Removing it meant risking the return of chaos, and chaos was remembered vividly. Authorities learned to frame permanence as protection. Rules were no longer described as emergency responses, but as traditions. They were linked to morality, religion, or natural order. Questioning them became difficult, not because of force, but because of habit. You can see this most clearly in how medieval people spoke about order itself. Order was not abstract. It meant knowing your place, your time, your boundaries. Emergency rules reinforced this clarity. They defined who could move, who could trade, who could gather. Over time, order became associated with virtue. Stability was seen as proof of righteousness. Change, even positive change, felt suspicious. The irony is that many of these routines survived long after their practical necessity faded. Towns kept curfews even when threats diminished. Markets retained controls long after famine ended. Labor restrictions persisted despite changing economies. These systems endured because removing them required imagination, and imagination was risky. From your modern perspective, it is tempting to judge these choices. You might wonder why people accepted so much control, but to them, control meant survival. Freedom without security was not appealing. They had lived through too many disasters to trust uncertainty. Now, you begin to see how deeply emergencies shaped medieval life, not just in laws and structures, but in mindset. People learned to live inside solutions that were never meant to be permanent. They built identities around them. They passed them down as wisdom. And this leads to a final, unresolved tension. If entire systems can grow out of temporary fear, how do you ever know when it is truly safe to let them go? By the time you reach the later centuries of the medieval world, the emergency rules of earlier generations no longer feel like responses to danger. They feel inevitable. They shape how you wake, work, worship, and rest. You do not experience them as restrictions imposed by authority, but as the background structure of life itself. This is how temporary survival strategies complete their transformation into lasting systems. To see this clearly, you can follow a single rule across time, watching how its meaning slowly changes. Take the regulation of time. During emergencies, towns needed coordination. Gates had to close, watches had to change shifts, markets had to open and end in orderly fashion. Bells became essential tools. They signaled danger, curfew, prayer, and work. At first, these sounds were warnings. They told you when to act because something was wrong. As emergencies repeated, the bells became familiar. You began to organize your day around them. Work started when the bell rang. Meals followed predictable patterns. Sleep came sooner because the town quieted earlier. Over generations, time itself became regulated. People no longer measured days by sunlight alone, but by shared signals. What began as emergency coordination evolved into structured daily schedules, laying foundations for modern-time discipline. Another example lies in public authority. In moments of crisis, people accepted strong leadership. Quick decisions mattered more than debate. Councils were given expanded powers. Officials enforced rules with little tolerance for dissent. These measures were justified as necessary. Once crises ended, that authority rarely returned fully to its earlier limits. People had grown accustomed to centralized decision-making. It reduced uncertainty. Leaders learned that decisive control prevented panic. Over time, communities began to expect intervention during any disruption, not just emergencies. The idea that authority should manage risk became normalized. This shift had long-lasting consequences. Medieval towns slowly developed administrative classes, whose purpose was not merely to respond to disaster, but to prevent it. Inspections, permits, and routine enforcement grew from emergency practices. The concept of governance itself expanded from occasional rule to continuous oversight. You can also trace permanence in how medieval people thought about responsibility. During emergencies, individuals were held accountable not just for their own actions, but for their potential impact on others. A careless fire could destroy a neighborhood. A sick traveler could spread disease. Temporary rules demanded restraint for the collective good. As these rules persisted, they reshaped moral expectations. Being responsible came to mean compliance. Good citizenship meant following regulations, even when the immediate danger was not visible. This quiet moral shift is one of the most enduring legacies of medieval emergency culture. Even economic behavior was altered. Merchants learned to operate within fixed systems. Weights, measures, prices, and licenses became standardized, initially imposed to prevent exploitation during crisis. These standards created trust. Trade became more predictable. Markets expanded. People forgot that flexibility had once been the norm. By the late medieval period, towns functioned as regulated environments. Life felt orderly compared to earlier centuries. This order was not the result of long-term planning. It was the accumulation of short-term fixes layered one upon another. What is striking is how rarely these systems were questioned. They were not debated as political ideas. They were accepted as practical reality. Children learned them before they could read. Newcomers adapted or left. The origin stories faded, replaced by sayings about tradition and common sense. You might expect resistance, and there was some, but resistance tended to focus on abuse, not existence. People complained about unfair enforcement, not about the idea of rules themselves. The memory of chaos remained powerful enough to justify structure. As the medieval world slowly gave way to early modern societies, these inherited routines traveled forward. Cities expanded, states centralized, new technologies emerged, yet the emergency-born habits remained. Time discipline became stricter, bureaucracy grew denser, regulation became more detailed. From your perspective, this story feels familiar. Modern life is shaped by systems created during crises. Safety standards, surveillance, work schedules, and public health measures often originate in moments of fear. Over time, they become normal. Few remember their origins. The medieval experience offers a quiet lesson. Human societies are conservative, not because they resist change, but because they cling to solutions that once worked. Survival strategies feel trustworthy. Removing them feels dangerous, even when the original threat is long gone. As you drift toward rest, consider how many aspects of your daily routine are inherited from people who lived through emergencies they hoped would never return. Consider how often safety quietly becomes structure, and structure becomes identity. And the final question remains unresolved, just as it was for them. How do you tell the difference between a rule that protects you and one that simply refuses to leave once its purpose is fulfilled? You begin this story at the edge of daylight. The sun is low, stretching shadows across the walls of a medieval town. People move with quiet urgency. Stalls close, doors shut, voices soften. Somewhere nearby, a bell prepares to ring. When it does, it will not announce celebration or prayer. It will announce withdrawal. It will tell you that the town is closing itself for the night. The medieval curfew did not begin as a moral rule or a lifestyle choice. It began as fear management. In a world without street lighting, organized policing, or rapid communication, night was dangerous. Darkness concealed strangers. It hid fires, crimes, and rebellions until they were already too large to control. When trouble came, it almost always came at night. The word curfew itself comes from the idea of covering the fire. In many towns, households were required to extinguish or safely cover hearth fires at a certain hour. This rule was not symbolic. Fire was one of the greatest threats to medieval life. Buildings were close together, roofs were made of thatch or wood. A single unattended flame could erase an entire neighborhood before morning. At first, the curfew was a direct response to disaster. After major fires destroyed towns, authorities imposed strict evening controls. Fires were to be banked. Movement was limited. People were expected to remain indoors. These rules were announced with bells, so everyone could hear them, regardless of literacy. But fire was not the only concern. During times of unrest, night movement allowed conspiracies to form. Riots often began after sunset. Armed groups used darkness for cover. Curfews became a way to freeze the town in place. If everyone was home, everyone was visible in their absence. You must imagine how fragile authority felt. A medieval town council had limited reach. It could not patrol every street at all hours, but it could control time. By shrinking the active hours of the town, it reduced risk. Fewer hours meant fewer opportunities for chaos. At first, these measures were clearly temporary. They were announced during emergencies and lifted afterward. People complained but understood the reason. Survival required inconvenience. No one expected the rule to define daily life. Yet emergencies repeated. Fires returned. Conflicts flared. Disease spread. Each time, the curfew was reinstated. Each time people adjusted more quickly. Children grew up hearing the bell and learning what it meant before they understood why. Over time, the curfew began to shift from reaction to routine. Towns started keeping it even during calmer periods. Officials argued that prevention was better than response. If fires were less likely when hearths were controlled every night, why stop? If crime was lower when streets were empty, why reopen them? The bell became part of the daily rhythm. Workdays ended earlier. Meals were timed to ensure everyone was home before dark. Social life adapted. Visits were planned carefully. Taverns adjusted hours. Night became private again. What is important here is not just the rule, but how it reshaped behavior. People learned to associate night with rest, silence, and withdrawal. Activity after dark became suspicious by default. Anyone outside without reason drew attention. This association went deeper than safety. Night began to carry moral weight. Being indoors was seen as responsible. Being outside suggested recklessness or bad intent. Over generations, this moral framing hardened. You can see this in town records. Fines for breaking curfew were common. Repeat offenders were named. Their behavior was noted not just as illegal, but as disruptive to order. Curfew breakers were described as disturbers of peace, even when no harm occurred. The rule also reinforced social hierarchy. Wealthy people could sometimes obtain permission to move at night. Officials, messengers, and guards were exempt. The poor rarely were. Night control became another way to sort society, quietly and efficiently. For women, the curfew carried additional expectations. Being outdoors at night exposed them to suspicion. Respectability became linked to visibility within the household after sunset. This was not written as law, but it was enforced socially. The physical design of towns adjusted as well. Streets became narrower and more inward-facing. Homes turned inward around courtyards. Windows were small. Public spaces were designed for daylight use. The town itself assumed that night belonged to stillness. What began as an emergency fire prevention measure had now shaped architecture, morality, and daily rhythm. And still, few people questioned it. The bell had always rung. The night had always closed. Now, you are left with a quiet uncertainty. If a rule changes how people think about time itself, how easily can it ever be undone? And if night once belonged to danger, can it ever belong to freedom again? Once the curfew stopped being announced as a temporary measure, it began to sink deeper into medieval life. You would no longer hear it described as something imposed because of danger. Instead, it was explained as the proper way a town functioned. People spoke of it as order, not restriction. This change in language mattered. It marked the moment when emergency became expectation. You can feel this shift most clearly in how people planned their days. Work routines shortened, farmers adjusted market travel to ensure they returned before evening. Artisans organized labor so that tools were put away well before sunset. Life bent itself around the bell. Time was no longer fluid. It was segmented into permitted and forbidden hours. This division shaped how people understood responsibility. Being late was not merely inconvenient. It was risky. Missing the bell meant being locked out or fined. It meant explaining yourself to guards or neighbors. Over time, punctuality became a moral trait. A reliable person was someone who respected the curfew. Towns reinforced this through enforcement that was steady rather than harsh. Guards did not need to punish severely. The rules were simple and consistent. Most people complied automatically. Social pressure did the rest. A neighbor seen wandering after curfew drew attention. Attention brought questions. Questions brought discomfort. The curfew also changed how medieval people experienced silence. Once the bell rang, the town settled into quiet. Shops closed, streets emptied. Sounds carried farther. A dropped object or raised voice stood out. Silence became a form of safety. It allowed danger to be detected quickly. This expectation of silence influenced architecture. Buildings were designed to contain noise. Thick walls and inward-facing rooms became common. Windows were shuttered early. The physical environment supported the behavioral rule. Over time, it became difficult to imagine nightlife of any kind within town walls. Children absorbed these patterns without instruction. They learned when play ended. They learned that the bell mattered. Bedtime aligned with authority rather than personal choice. These lessons did not feel political. They felt natural. Order was simply how life worked. The curfew also shaped how medieval people thought about strangers. Anyone outside after dark was assumed to have a reason. If that reason was not obvious, suspicion followed. Guards asked questions. Neighbors watched from doorways. Trust narrowed. This mattered deeply during times of migration. Travelers arriving late were often turned away. Inns filled early. Towns became less accessible at night. Movement slowed. This reduced risk but also reinforced isolation. Each town became a closed system after sunset. Women experienced this system differently. Their presence outdoors at night was often interpreted as evidence of moral failing. This was not always written law, but it was enforced through gossip and reputation. The curfew strengthened existing gender expectations by making visibility a marker of virtue. Religion reinforced these habits. Evening prayers aligned with the bell. Darkness was framed as a time for reflection and rest rather than activity. Sermons spoke of night as a time when temptation grew stronger. Staying indoors became both practical and virtuous. What is striking is how little resistance appears in records. People complained about enforcement, about fines, about exceptions granted to elites. But few argued that the curfew itself was unnecessary. The memory of disaster remained close enough to justify it. In some towns, the original reason for the curfew was forgotten entirely. People no longer remembered the fire or riot that first prompted it. Instead, they explained it as tradition. The bell had always rung, the night had always closed. As generations passed, the curfew became a marker of civilization itself. Towns without strict evening rules were described as disorderly. Travelers wrote of places where nightlife continued with surprise or disapproval. Control became synonymous with safety. This attitude followed medieval society into later centuries. Even as street lighting improved and policing expanded, the idea that night required regulation remained. Laws evolved, curfews changed form, but the underlying belief stayed intact. You can see this legacy in how modern cities still regulate night behavior. Noise laws, closing hours, restricted movement for certain groups. These are not direct copies of medieval rules, but they share the same logic. Night is treated as different. It is managed rather than trusted. Now, you are left with a quiet question. If generations learn to fear the night because of rules created long ago, can darkness ever become neutral again, or does control linger long after danger fades? By the late medieval period, the curfew no longer felt like an interruption to life. It felt like life itself. You would not describe your day as ending early, you would describe it as ending when it was supposed to. The bell did not chase you indoors. It confirmed that the world was functioning as it should. At this stage, The curfew had fully separated from its origins. Few people could explain when it began or why. It was preserved through habit, reinforced by architecture, and justified through morality. Even when towns experienced long stretches of peace, the curfew remained untouched. Removing it would have felt like removing the walls themselves. You can see this permanence in town charters and local customs. Curfew enforcement became routine administration. Guards were scheduled. Fines were standardized. Exceptions were formalized. The rule was no longer reactive. It was procedural. The curfew also shaped how medieval people thought about freedom. Freedom was not defined by unrestricted movement. It was defined by predictable boundaries. Knowing when to be indoors created a sense of security. People trusted the system because it was familiar. This had subtle psychological effects. People planned less spontaneously. Evening gatherings were small and private. Social bonds formed within daylight hours. Night became a time of withdrawal, rather than connection. Over time, this influenced creativity and culture. Music, storytelling, and craft work moved indoors. Public performance faded after sunset. Culture became quieter, intimate, rather than communal. The night belonged to the household, not the town. Even crime adapted. Thieves learned to work within curfew systems or bribe officials. The existence of rules did not eliminate wrongdoing, but it channeled it. Control changed the shape of disorder rather than erasing it. As medieval society transitioned toward early modern life, new technologies emerged. Oil lamps improved. Streets became slightly safer. Yet the curfew remained. It was defended not as fire prevention or riot control, but as tradition. Tradition is powerful because it feels older than choice. Eventually, curfews evolved rather than disappeared. They became targeted. Certain professions were exempt. Certain districts developed different rules, but the idea that time could be regulated never left. From your modern perspective, this story feels familiar. You still live with closing hours. You still hear complaints about noise after dark. You still associate night with caution. These attitudes are inherited, not inevitable. The medieval curfew teaches a quiet lesson. Emergency rules do not vanish when danger fades. They reshape how people imagine safety, morality, and normal life. Once time itself is regulated, it is difficult to return it to freedom. As you drift toward rest, consider how often the end of your day is shaped not by tiredness, but by expectation. And consider this final question, left unresolved just as it was centuries ago. If safety taught people to fear the night, what would it take to teach them to trust it again? You are living in a medieval world where bread is not a side dish. It is life itself. Almost every meal depends on it. Rich or poor, young or old, bread fills stomachs when nothing else can. When grain is plentiful, life feels stable. When grain fails, everything begins to unravel. Famine in the medieval period was not rare. It returned again and again, shaped by weather, war, failed transport, or poor storage. A single bad harvest could push an entire region into hunger. 2 bad seasons in a row could empty towns. People did not starve quietly. Hunger made them visible, restless, and afraid. At first, famine was treated as a natural disaster or a divine test. Communities prayed. They rationed informally. Families shared what they could. But as populations grew and towns became more crowded, hunger became harder to manage. Desperation spread quickly. Bread riots became common. Bakers were attacked. Grain carts were stopped in the streets. Authorities responded, not out of compassion alone, but out of fear. Hungry people threatened order. Starving crowds could overturn markets and councils alike. Something had to be done, and it had to be done quickly. The first bread laws were emergency measures. Town councils fixed the price of bread. Bakers were ordered to sell loaves at set weights and costs. Even if it meant losing money, grain hoarding was banned. Exporting grain during shortages was punished harshly. These laws were not theoretical. Inspectors weighed loaves in public. Bakers were fined or shamed if they cheated. In some towns, bad bread was destroyed publicly as a warning. These actions were meant to calm crowds and prevent violence. At first, everyone understood that these rules were temporary. Once the harvest improved, prices would return to normal. Bakers would regain control. Markets would breathe again. But famine rarely ended cleanly. Recovery was slow. Fear lingered. People remembered how close they came to starvation. Councils hesitated to remove controls too quickly. What if hunger returned? What if prices rose again? Meanwhile, something unexpected happened. Fixed bread laws created stability. People knew what to expect. Bakers knew the rules. Buyers trusted the loaf. Even when grain became more available, the regulated system felt safer than free fluctuation. Bread laws also created a new moral idea. Bread was no longer just a product. It became a responsibility. Authorities spoke of fair bread and just weight. Feeding the poor was framed as a duty of governance, not charity alone. Over time, towns wrote these emergency rules into permanent law. They were recorded, standardized, and enforced even outside famine years. Children grew up assuming that bread had an official price and size. Few questioned why. What began as a response to hunger quietly reshaped economic thinking. Food was no longer left entirely to market forces. Survival demanded oversight. Now, one thought remains unresolved. When food laws are born from fear of starvation, can they ever truly disappear once hunger retreats? Once bread laws settled into daily life, famine no longer needed to be present for control to continue. You would walk through the market and see the same weights, the same prices, the same inspections, even in years when grain was reasonably abundant. What had begun as a desperate response to hunger had quietly become a system of trust. This trust mattered deeply. Medieval markets were fragile places. Rumors moved faster than carts. If people believed bakers were cheating, or prices would rise tomorrow, panic could begin immediately. Crowds did not wait for proof. They reacted to fear. Bread laws acted as reassurance. They told you that someone was watching. Authorities understood this psychological power. By keeping bread regulated, they reduced the chance of unrest before it began. A stable loaf meant a stable crowd. Hunger was dangerous, but uncertainty was often worse. Bakers, at first resentful, learned to adapt. Fixed prices limited profit, but they also reduced risk. Competition became predictable. Supply chains stabilized. Guilds formed around shared standards. Over time, bakers themselves defended the laws that once constrained them. The poor experienced these changes most directly. Bread laws did not eliminate hunger, but they slowed its spread. Even during hardship, a loaf could still be purchased. This created a fragile safety net, not generous, but dependable. Charity shifted as well. Instead of random alms, towns organized grain distribution. Public ovens appeared in some regions. These were not acts of kindness alone. They were tools to prevent disorder. Bread inspections became rituals. Officials weighed loaves publicly. Punishments were symbolic as much as practical. A dishonest baker might be paraded or fined. These acts reassured the crowd that fairness existed. Over time, bread became political. A ruler who kept bread affordable was praised. One who failed faced unrest. The link between governance and food security hardened. What is striking is how little this system resembled free trade. Medieval people accepted regulation because they remembered famine. The memory of empty stomachs outweighed abstract ideas of market freedom. By the later medieval period, bread laws were no longer discussed as emergency tools. They were tradition. Towns copied one another. Rules spread across regions. Now a question lingers quietly. When survival creates regulation that feels just, does removing it feel like cruelty rather than freedom? By the time medieval society moved beyond its worst cycles of famine, bread laws no longer felt connected to hunger at all. They felt like moral architecture. You would not ask why bread had a fixed weight or price. You would ask why anyone would dare to change it. At this stage, bread regulation had fully shifted from emergency response to ethical standard. A good town was one where bread was fair. A just ruler was one who protected the loaf. The language surrounding food hardened into virtue. This shift mattered because it altered how people understood responsibility. Hunger was no longer seen only as personal misfortune or divine will. It became a failure of oversight. If bread was unavailable or unfairly priced, blame followed authority. Over generations, this expectation shaped governance itself. Town councils maintained grain reserves. Officials monitored harvests. Food security became a permanent concern rather than a seasonal fear. Even when trade expanded and markets grew more complex, bread laws endured. They were adjusted, not removed. Prices shifted slowly, standards evolved, but the principle remained. Survival justified control. From your modern vantage point, this story feels familiar. Subsidies, price controls, and food regulations echo medieval fears. They are born not from ideology, but from memory. As you settle into rest, consider this final unresolved thought. When food laws are created to prevent suffering, how do you decide when trust in survival can finally replace fear of hunger? You are living in a medieval town that smells faintly of smoke, animals, and damp stone. Life feels crowded even on ordinary days. People share wells, streets, walls, and air. Illness is common, but usually familiar. Fevers come and go, coughs linger, death is present, but predictable. Then something changes. The plague does not arrive loudly. It does not announce itself with banners or armies. It moves quietly, carried by ships, carts, and travelers who appear no different from anyone else. At first, people notice strange swellings, sudden weakness, and death that comes too quickly to understand. Entire households fall ill within days. Fear spreads faster than the disease itself. Medieval society is not prepared for this kind of disaster. There is no clear explanation. Some blame divine punishment. Others blame corrupted air, foreign travelers, or moral failure. What everyone agrees on is that normal life cannot continue. Something must be done, even if no one is certain it will work. The first plague rules are desperate and improvised. Towns close gates. Markets are restricted. Travelers are turned away or isolated. The sick are ordered to stay inside. Families are marked. Homes are avoided. These measures are not based on scientific knowledge. They are based on observation, fear, and instinct. What authorities notice quickly is that separation matters. Where people mix less, fewer fall ill. Streets that empty seem safer. Homes that close themselves off survive longer. From this observation, rules emerge. At first, these rules are clearly temporary. They are announced as emergency orders. Once the sickness passes, life is expected to resume as before. People endure isolation because the alternative is death. One of the earliest and most important measures is quarantine, though it is not yet called that. Ships arriving from affected regions are held outside ports. Travelers are delayed. Goods are inspected or destroyed. These delays are inconvenient and costly, but fear outweighs profit. Inside towns, movement is controlled. Gatherings are banned. Churches close or limit attendance. Processions stop. Public celebrations vanish. The social life of the town collapses inward. Homes with sickness are marked. In some places, symbols are painted on doors. Guards are posted. Residents are forbidden to leave. Food is delivered if possible. Neighbors avoid contact. This isolation is terrifying, but it creates distance between disease and community. At first, these measures are chaotic. Enforcement is uneven. Some people flee, others hide illness. But over time, patterns emerge. Towns that act quickly lose fewer people. Those that hesitate suffer more. This observation hardens into belief. Separation saves lives. Distance protects the healthy. Control prevents collapse. Once the plague recedes, towns face a decision. Do they remove these rules and return to normal life? Or do they keep parts of them, just in case? The plague does not come once. It returns again and again across generations. Each time, towns reuse the same strategies. Each time, the rules become more familiar. Fear teaches memory. Slowly, plague measures stop being described as emergency responses. They become standard procedure. Towns develop plans for outbreak response. Officials are assigned roles. Buildings are designated for isolation. Even during years without plague, certain behaviors remain. Travelers are viewed with suspicion. Illness becomes a reason for separation. Cleanliness, once inconsistent, gains importance. Air, space, and order are discussed with new seriousness. What begins to change most deeply is how people think about proximity. Being close to others is no longer automatically good. It is potentially dangerous. Crowds are no longer just lively, they are risky. This shift affects everything. Markets become regulated. Homes are reorganized. Streets are widened where possible. Burial practices change. The dead are moved faster and farther away from the living. Authorities learn that visible action calms fear. Even if measures are imperfect, they signal control. Doing something feels safer than doing nothing. Over time, these actions become expected. People begin to judge leadership based on response to disease. A ruler who imposes restrictions is seen as protective. One who hesitates is blamed for deaths. Governance becomes tied to health. What is striking is how many of these measures remain after plague fades. Isolation of the sick becomes normal. Travel controls persist. Fear of contamination lingers. The idea that disease can be managed through rules takes root. Children grow up knowing that illness means withdrawal. That contact can kill. That authority can close the world when danger appears. These lessons are not forgotten. Now, one question remains unsettled. When fear teaches society how to protect itself, how do you ever fully forget what fear has taught you? Once plague rules had been enforced repeatedly, they began to embed themselves in medieval life, even in years when no sickness appeared. You would walk through the town and notice subtle patterns, streets that were wider or cleaner, marketplaces with inspection tables, travelers kept at the edge of town. The world itself had been reshaped by fear. Quarantine became routine. Ships arriving from other ports were delayed, not only during outbreaks but as a precaution. Merchants understood that being too eager could risk closure. They carried documentation, certificates of health, and letters from other towns confirming their safety. This system was slow, inconvenient, and often confusing, but it had become standard procedure. The temporary had hardened into the expected. Inside towns, households adjusted permanently. Sick rooms were separated from the rest of the home. Food was delivered carefully. Visiting friends or neighbors after illness became socially discouraged. Even after generations passed, people instinctively understood which interactions were risky. Proximity was measured, not assumed. Public gatherings shifted. Festivals, markets, and religious processions were limited or organized in smaller groups. The social calendar was structured with health in mind. Even when no plague was present, the fear of disease shaped behavior. People learned to anticipate risk and to internalize caution. Merchants and officials adapted. Bakers continued to weigh loaves carefully, not only to prevent famine but to reduce gathering of crowds and disputes during illness. Inns developed separate rooms or courtyards to prevent cross-contamination. Markets built temporary barriers or scheduled staggered sales. Infrastructure itself began reflecting precautionary principles. Religious life, too, was altered. Church services were timed to prevent crowding. Holy water fonts and communal objects were handled carefully. Even simple acts, such as shaking hands or sharing a meal, were questioned and limited. Faith and survival became intertwined, with rituals adjusted to prevent the spread of unseen danger. The mindset of townspeople evolved quietly, but profoundly. Health became a shared responsibility. Rules were no longer optional during emergency, and over time they were rarely optional even outside crisis. Compliance became a moral duty. Ignoring it was seen as selfish or dangerous, not merely inconvenient. Authorities found that enforcing rules became easier once behavior was internalized. People had learned to anticipate regulations before they were formally stated. Neighborhoods monitored themselves. Social pressure reinforced official control. Fear became habit. Survival became custom. Interestingly, plague rules also reshaped economic practices. Trade shifted to reduce risk, goods were transported with care, storage practices improved, and travel networks became more controlled. Markets continued to implement spacing rules and hygiene measures, not because a specific outbreak required it, but because communities had learned that prevention reduced disruption. Even the perception of danger remained heightened. Towns remembered previous outbreaks vividly. Storytelling, gossip, and local chronicles preserved details of deaths and household collapses. Memory reinforced behavior. Fear was no longer immediate. It became historical, passed down, shaping decisions centuries after the first outbreak. And yet, as pervasive as these rules had become, they were never perfect. People found loopholes. Some avoided inspection, some hid illness, some resented restrictions. But the failures never dismantled the system. The lessons learned from repeated plague cycles outweighed individual resistance. By now, plague management had fully transitioned from emergency response to cultural expectation. Isolation, inspection, and caution had become part of daily life. Authority was trusted to act in crisis. Citizens were trained to anticipate danger. Streets, homes, markets, and religious spaces were all subtly adapted to prevent disaster, whether disaster existed or not. Now a question lingers quietly in the background. When a society's habits and physical structures are shaped by fear of disease, how easily can that fear ever be let go even when the danger itself fades? By the later medieval period, the rules born from plague were no longer seen as temporary measures. They had become part of the very structure of towns, governance, and daily life. Streets were organized for movement and airflow. Homes were built with separation in mind. Markets had long-standing inspection routines, and travelers were always treated with suspicion. What was once an emergency response had hardened into expectation. The psychological impact was profound. People had internalized caution. Being near the sick, sharing food, or attending crowded gatherings felt inherently risky. Children grew up understanding boundaries and separation as normal, not as reactive measures. Social behavior, architecture, and commerce were all shaped by centuries of precaution. Even the language of morality had shifted. Obedience to plague rules became associated with virtue, disobedience with recklessness. Authorities were praised not merely for enforcing law, but for protecting health. Governance itself was evaluated by the town's ability to prevent disease. Public health had become an unspoken but central criterion of good leadership. Interestingly, these measures also reshaped social hierarchy and mobility. Travelers, merchants, and laborers learned to document their movements carefully. Those who could afford private quarters or isolated transport had advantages. Lower-status individuals were more constrained by quarantine practices, curfews, and neighborhood vigilance. Survival rules reinforced social divisions as naturally as geography reinforced trade routes. The economy adapted as well. Merchants structured their schedules around inspections, storage standards, and sanitation practices. Markets became predictable and orderly, which increased trust and trade efficiency. Even when plague subsided, these routines persisted because the infrastructure worked. Prevention was easier than rebuilding after chaos. Religious and cultural practices shifted quietly but permanently. Church attendance, once a communal experience, adapted to limit exposure. Holy objects, processions, and festivals were organized around safety. Spiritual life and survival strategy merged, creating traditions that seemed timeless. In time, these rituals were no longer about immediate fear, but about proper conduct. By now, it was impossible to separate the lessons of plague from the rhythm of daily life. Society had learned to live inside the measures created for crisis, and these measures shaped perceptions of order, safety, and morality. The town itself had been transformed by repeated fear. Narrow alleys became wider, homes were partitioned, and markets became structured in ways that would feel familiar to anyone visiting centuries later. From a modern perspective, it is striking how persistent these habits became. Systems for public health, quarantine, urban planning, and social responsibility were all born from survival instincts. What started as emergency rules hardened into traditions, shaping governance, commerce, and everyday behavior for generations. As you reflect on this history, one unresolved question remains. When rules are born from fear and maintained for survival, how do we ever know whether they are still necessary or simply too ingrained to be questioned? The plague left a legacy not just of death, but of habits that endured long after the danger passed, quietly shaping the way humans live together. You are stepping into a medieval town, where sickness is not a rare occurrence, but an everyday companion. Fevers, wounds, infections, and lingering illnesses spread quietly, often untreated. The concept of specialized care is almost non-existent. Healing takes place in homes, in monasteries, or at the mercy of itinerant healers. There is no system, no central place to go when illness strikes. Most people rely on family or charity, and those without care often die in silence. The earliest hospitals were not what you imagine today. They were often religious institutions, created to care for the poor, pilgrims, or travelers. Monks and nuns offered beds, food, and prayers. Medicine was rudimentary. Herbs, poultices, and rudimentary surgical techniques were combined with spiritual guidance. Healing was as much about comfort and ritual as it was about treatment. Emergency need, however, drove change. Outbreaks of disease, waves of plague, and sudden floods or famines overwhelmed these small-scale facilities. The existing monasteries could not house the sick, the dying, and the poor simultaneously. People began improvising. Town councils or wealthy patrons converted large buildings into shelters specifically for the ill. Former inns, abandoned houses, or empty guild halls were pressed into service. At first, these were temporary solutions. A building was opened because a wave of illness had arrived. Beds were set up, caregivers were recruited. Sometimes the town appointed officials to oversee distribution of food, herbs, and bedding. Rules were minimal. Sick individuals stayed inside. The healthy avoided the space. Crowds were monitored to prevent contagion. Families delivered what they could, but responsibility largely fell to the institution. What is striking is how quickly people adapted to these emergency arrangements. Local healers and clergy organized rotation schedules. Volunteers monitored the sick. Food was portioned to stretch supplies. Even administration, which had been informal, became structured. Someone needed to record who was admitted, what treatments were used, and which individuals recovered or died. These records, initially meant only to keep track during the crisis, slowly became the foundation for standard hospital administration. You must imagine the chaos. Rooms were crowded, smells were overwhelming, and disease spread easily. Care was basic. There were no antibiotics, no sterile techniques. Yet, even basic attention, food, warmth, cleanliness, and isolation, improved survival in measurable ways. People began to notice which practices worked and which were harmful. Beds were arranged to minimize contact. Meals were organized to prevent sharing utensils. Sick rooms were separated by type of illness whenever possible. Interestingly, the expansion of these emergency facilities created a social precedent. Once a town had a building dedicated to care, it became politically and morally difficult to close it once the immediate crisis ended. Authorities and benefactors found that a permanent hospital was not just useful, it was expected. Citizens learned to rely on its existence. Even wealthier residents, who could hire private care, began supporting the institutions through donations, recognizing that their own safety was linked to the health of the broader community. The accidental permanence of these hospitals was reinforced by the church. Monks and nuns who oversaw care were skilled at framing their work as a moral duty. Closing a hospital was portrayed as neglectful, uncharitable, or even sinful. Town councils, already invested in the structures and staffing, quietly accepted this moral framework. The emergency response had become a lasting institution. You can see this process in towns across Europe. Buildings that were opened for short-term crises survived multiple outbreaks. With each reuse, the rules became more codified. Food distribution, record-keeping, sanitation procedures, and staffing schedules evolved into formal practices. The hospital became not just a shelter for the sick, but a center of authority, knowledge, and social order. Even medical practice began to adapt around these spaces. Students and apprentices learned in hospitals, treatments were documented and shared. Experiments in hygiene, diet, and care were possible because the population was centralized. What began as an improvised emergency measure unintentionally created a platform for the development of organized medicine. By the end of this first phase, it is clear that what began as a temporary response to crises had unintentionally laid the foundation for modern hospitals. A building filled with the sick, originally meant to manage a single wave of disease, had grown into an enduring institution. Its rules, procedures, and very existence were preserved long after the immediate emergency had passed. And yet, as you step back and look at the situation, one question remains unresolved. If hospitals arose from necessity and fear rather than careful planning, how much of their structure, their rules, and even their ethics are inherited from panic rather than deliberate design? Once these emergency hospitals became familiar, their presence began to shape not just medical care, but the rhythm of town life itself. You would walk past one and notice subtle changes. Quiet courtyards, regulated traffic of visitors, the smell of herbs and food carefully rationed. People adjusted their behavior around these institutions without thinking. Sick neighbors were directed here. Travelers knew where to report. Families planned for isolation. The hospital was no longer a reaction. It was a tool for organizing society. Administrators realized that temporary measures needed permanent oversight. Someone had to keep track of beds, supplies, and patients. Records, once kept for crisis management, became standard documentation. The very act of writing down who was sick, what treatments were administered, and which patients recovered became routine. This allowed hospitals to anticipate outbreaks, manage staffing, and even allocate food more effectively. What began as emergency bookkeeping gradually became bureaucracy. Staffing became another enduring feature. Volunteers and religious caretakers were initially recruited in moments of need, but over time, towns appointed regular personnel, roles were defined, some prepared food, others cleaned rooms, and a few oversaw treatments. Even when the crisis passed, these positions persisted. The idea that care required dedicated, organized labor became natural. Families understood that proper care could not rely solely on ad hoc assistance. Medical practices themselves were shaped by the hospital structure. Observing multiple patients in one space allowed healers to compare symptoms and outcomes. Techniques that seemed effective were repeated. Harmful practices were avoided. These emergent lessons spread slowly across towns as records were shared. You could say that hospitals became the first centers of systematic medical observation, even if their founders never intended them to be scientific. The moral dimension also reinforced permanence. Monks and nuns framed hospital work as duty and virtue. Town leaders framed support for hospitals as civic responsibility. Closing a hospital would appear neglectful, even immoral. Citizens came to expect these institutions, and their disappearance would have been socially and politically unacceptable. A temporary measure had evolved into a community expectation. Public perception shaped the rules as much as necessity. People avoided entering hospitals unnecessarily. Knowing the risk of contagion, families respected boundaries. The sick understood isolation as protection rather than punishment. Even the layout of the building, rooms separated, courtyards ventilated, kitchens centralized, was adapted to minimize danger. What began as makeshift adjustments to crisis became enduring standards of operation. Economic behavior adapted as well. Towns invested in hospitals because they reduced disruption. A community with a functioning hospital could survive outbreaks with less chaos. Merchants continued trading, markets remained functional, and labor productivity suffered less. The cost of maintaining hospitals became justified by the stability they provided. Once the infrastructure existed, removing it would have been reckless. Over time, hospitals spread geographically. One town's emergency hospital inspired another. Methods, layouts, and staffing patterns were copied. Practices became codified in manuals or town ordinances. What began as improvised responses to illness evolved into an entire administrative model that would influence urban planning and medical care for centuries. Yet, despite this growth, the origin of hospitals as emergency measures was largely forgotten. People came to assume that such care had always existed. Its structure, its rules, and its procedures felt natural. The urgency that once prompted creation had faded, leaving behind something far more permanent, an institution that shaped life, morality, and even social order. Now, a quiet question lingers. If hospitals arose from panic and necessity, how much of modern healthcare, its bureaucracy, its hierarchies, its ethics, is still shaped by the survival strategies of a fearful medieval world? By the late medieval period, hospitals had fully transitioned from temporary emergency shelters to enduring institutions. You would no longer see them as improvised responses to crisis. They were part of the town's identity. Their presence signaled order, care, and authority. Citizens expected them, travelers relied on them, and officials used them as tools to maintain social stability. The rules that were first written in haste, who could enter, how the sick were treated, where food was delivered, had become formalized. Beds were assigned. Supplies were inventoried regularly. Staff had defined roles, sometimes with titles and salaries. These procedures were not questioned, even in years when no epidemic threatened the town. What had begun as improvisation had solidified into standard governance. The hospital shaped social and moral norms as much as it shaped physical space. Visiting the sick became socially regulated. Offering unauthorized care could be criticized. Families learned to trust institutions rather than improvising in panic. Obedience to hospital rules became a marker of virtue, while disregarding them was associated with irresponsibility. Over generations, care and morality intertwined so tightly that it was hard to separate one from the other. Medical knowledge was subtly transformed. Even without formal science, repeated observation in hospitals allowed patterns to emerge. Healers noted which treatments worked, which illnesses spread quickly, and how isolation reduced contagion. The accumulation of knowledge, initially a side effect of emergency care, laid a foundation for more systematic medicine. Hospitals had become laboratories of survival. Economic and civic life was influenced as well. A functioning hospital reduced social disruption. Towns with hospitals could absorb outbreaks without collapsing trade, production, or governance. Supporting a hospital became an investment in stability. Donors, whether wealthy citizens, guilds, or religious orders, reinforced their own security by funding care for the vulnerable. The emergency measure created an enduring network of dependency and trust. The spread of hospitals across Europe further reinforced their permanence. Each town learned from others, copying layouts, staffing models, and operational rules. The idea of a hospital became a universal expectation. Communities imagined life without them as dangerous or negligent. Even when the original crises that inspired these hospitals had faded, the institutions remained because their utility had become cultural, moral, and social. From your modern perspective, the story is familiar. Hospitals exist everywhere, but their roots lie not in planned design, research, or foresight. They exist because centuries ago, people faced fear, acted to survive, and inadvertently created structures that outlasted the immediate crisis. Emergency measures evolved into civic institutions, Fear became stability, necessity became tradition. As you reflect on this story, the final unresolved thought emerges. If the very rules, structures and ethics of hospitals were born from panic and improvisation, how much of our modern sense of care, order and responsibility is shaped less by rational planning and more by centuries of inherited survival instinct? You are walking through a medieval town as dusk begins to fall. Shadows stretch across narrow streets and quiet courtyards. You notice a figure on a tower, peering into the darkness. Another patrols the marketplace, a lantern swaying with each step. The streets feel safer, yet also strangely controlled. These watchers are not there for ceremony or tradition. They are there because the town has learned that night can be deadly. The medieval night watch began not as a civic choice, but as a reactive measure. Towns were vulnerable after sunset. Fires, theft, assault, and sudden outbreaks of violence could devastate a community before anyone could respond. There were no streetlights, few organized patrols, and no rapid communication. A single torch or guard could make the difference between survival and catastrophe. Initially, night watches were ad hoc. Citizens were assigned in rotation. Often reluctantly, volunteers carried torches, clanged bells, or shouted warnings. Some were wealthy enough to pay substitutes. Enforcement was inconsistent. Rules were simple: walk the streets, keep an eye on suspicious activity, warn the town if danger appeared. The goal was immediate protection, not long-term structure. As towns grew, emergencies multiplied. Fires broke out unexpectedly. Thieves moved in larger groups, and travelers sometimes carried disease or weapons. Authorities discovered that reactive measures were insufficient. Patrols needed schedules, authority, and accountability. Who was watching? When? For how long? These questions could not be left to chance. In response, temporary night watches were formalized. Guards were appointed by councils. Hours were set. Bell towers became central to signaling danger. Curfews aligned with patrol schedules. Neighborhoods were assigned to specific individuals or groups. Initially, these systems were justified as temporary, responding to immediate threats. Yet each repetition cemented their presence. The night watch affected daily life in subtle ways. People timed their work, social visits, and errands to avoid being outdoors after dark. Children learned to retreat to homes early. Noise and light were regulated. Streets became extensions of the guard system. The town itself adapted physically. Narrow alleys were blocked or monitored. Windows were shuttered, and gates were reinforced. Interestingly, this emergency measure began to shape social behavior. Presence or absence on the streets became a moral cue. A person walking at night without reason could be suspected of wrongdoing. Compliance with night watch rules came to signify responsibility, while violation indicated recklessness or criminal intent. Communities began to internalize authority. Control became self-enforcing. Guards themselves became an institutional fixture. Over time, towns appointed permanent watchmen. These roles offered regular pay, status, and recognition. Volunteer rotations faded. Knowledge accumulated. Veterans trained new recruits. Patrols followed patterns that had proven effective, and watchmen became familiar with residents, streets, and hazards. Emergency improvisation had become bureaucracy. The night watch also had legal implications. Those caught violating curfews or engaging in suspicious activity were fined, imprisoned, or publicly shamed. Over generations, these punishments reinforced compliance. Towns became safer, not merely through active patrols, but through ingrained social expectation. Authority extended beyond the guard to the moral and behavioral norms of the population. It is striking how quickly these temporary measures became permanent. What began as emergency protection evolved into a system that defined law, morality, and order. Streets, homes, and communities were organized around the presence of watchers. People forgot the improvisation that created the night watch. It simply existed, unquestioned, as part of town life. And yet, a question lingers. If a temporary response to fear becomes an enduring system of control, how much of the structure of law and order is built on generations of reaction, rather than deliberate planning? As night watches became more consistent, their influence spread beyond the immediate need for security. You begin to notice patterns: streets that are kept clear, windows that are shuttered early, families retreating to homes at predictable times. The town's daily rhythm begins to align with the presence of watchers. What was once temporary now structures life itself. The institutionalization of night patrols required formal organization. Guards were assigned to specific districts and shifts. Sometimes for months at a time, record-keeping became necessary. Which streets were patrolled, which incidents reported, which citizens required special attention. Night watchmen became the eyes and ears of municipal governance. Their reports informed councils about potential threats, minor disputes, and unusual activity. The town's administration began to depend on the system that had started as a reaction to fear. This structure affected social behavior subtly but powerfully. Being outdoors after dark became morally and socially suspicious. A wandering figure might be assumed to carry ill intent. Neighborhoods developed informal surveillance. Families watched one another, knowing that deviations from expected behavior would be noticed and reported. Fear of scrutiny reinforced obedience, even when guards were absent. Compliance became habitual. Economically, night watches also influenced commerce. Markets adjusted closing hours to match patrol schedules. Bakers, tavern owners, and merchants timed their operations to ensure the streets were clear when the bell rang. Businesses adapted, not because it was profitable, but because deviation risked fines or social censure. The town itself became a machine of order, with night watches as one of its regulating gears. The legal authority of night watches expanded over time. Initially, guards could only warn or report. Gradually, they were empowered to fine, detain, or call for additional intervention. Their role blurred the line between citizen and official, private vigilance and public authority. The temporary emergency measure had become a formal legal mechanism. Citizens came to accept this as normal governance. The watch also altered the physical environment. Streets were widened or cleared to allow patrols to move efficiently. Gates were reinforced and locked at scheduled times. Towns invested in lighting wherever possible, placing lanterns near critical intersections. Buildings were oriented to maximize visibility. In this way, the emergency system reshaped the very structure of urban life. Interestingly, the night watch also created a form of knowledge accumulation. Experienced guards trained newcomers, developed strategies for patrol routes, and noted patterns of theft, fire risk, or suspicious behavior. This institutional memory was unprecedented in towns where previously safety had been reactive and improvised. Lessons learned during crises became permanent procedures. The social and moral consequences were profound. Families taught children to respect the boundaries of night. The presence of a guard was a reminder that obedience was expected. Suspicion of strangers became routine. What had begun as practical survival strategy now shaped cultural norms. Behavior, morality, and social hierarchy were subtly dictated by a system born of fear. Yet despite the stability, questions lingered. The more permanent night watches became, the less people remembered their original purpose. Was the town safe because guards were present, or because fear and habit had reshaped behavior itself? Authority had shifted from reactive to self-reinforcing. Temporary measures had created a culture of compliance. Now, the unresolved thought remains. When emergency systems become permanent, do they protect society, or do they train it to expect control as a constant, even after the original threat has faded? By the later medieval period, the night watch had fully transformed from a temporary emergency response into a permanent fixture of urban life. You would no longer think of it as a reaction to immediate danger. It had become an integral part of governance, social behavior, and urban design. Streets, homes, and markets were all shaped by the expectation that someone was always watching after dark. The structure of the watch was now formalized. Guards had fixed shifts, uniforms, or insignia, and clear duties. Reports of disturbances were written and archived. Records of patrols, fines, and incidents were maintained, creating a bureaucracy that extended far beyond the original crisis. The temporary improvisation had hardened into a permanent administrative system. Social norms had adapted to match. Being outdoors at night without clear purpose was morally and socially questionable. Families taught children that wandering streets after dark was dangerous, not merely physically, but socially. Neighbors monitored one another. Suspicion became ingrained, and compliance became second nature. Fear had become habit. Economically, towns adjusted to the watch as well. Shops, markets, and taverns structured their hours around patrols. Businesses closed when the bell rang or restricted movement to avoid fines or confrontation. Over time, the rhythm of commerce, labor, and social life synced with the presence of night watches. The emergency measure had redefined the daily timetable of the town itself. The legal and civic authority of the watch had also expanded. Guards could now enforce curfews, detain offenders, and report violations to councils, making them essential agents of law. Authority shifted from temporary enforcement to a permanent mechanism of governance. Compliance was no longer voluntary, it was expected, codified and enforced. Even the urban landscape reflected the system. Streets were designed to allow patrols to move efficiently. Gates, walls, and passageways were maintained and fortified. Lanterns were installed where needed. Public spaces were organized for visibility and control. The town itself had been reshaped by the logic of surveillance and precaution. Interestingly, the night watch created knowledge that extended beyond security. Experienced guards trained newcomers, developed best practices, and passed down accumulated insights about urban risks. Over decades, what began as an improvised response became a repository of civic memory, an early form of institutional knowledge applied to daily life. From your perspective today, it is remarkable how much emergency measures shaped culture. The night watch was born of fear, yet it trained citizens to internalize caution, organize behavior around authority, and accept regulation as normal. Streets emptied at predictable times, families adapted routines, and social morality became intertwined with compliance. As this story concludes, one final reflection emerges. When temporary emergency systems persist for centuries, they do more than protect. They shape morality, habit, and expectation. What began as a survival strategy became a framework for society itself. And one lingering question remains: if order was born of fear, is society's obedience ever truly voluntary, or is it the echo of generations learning to survive the night? You are crossing a medieval bridge, stepping carefully over uneven stones, feeling the slight sway underfoot. The river below rages quietly, carrying debris, small fish, and the occasional log from upstream. You notice that the bridge is narrow enough that two carts cannot pass comfortably side by side, narrow enough that even pedestrians must step aside for one another. You might assume this was intentional, a design choice, but it was not. It was an emergency fix that became permanent. Medieval bridges were rarely designed for the scale of traffic they eventually carried. Most were constructed quickly in response to necessity. A flood had destroyed a ford, a town needed a safe crossing for trade, or a military campaign demanded rapid mobility. Builders often reused stones from ruined walls, local timber, and whatever labor was available. Speed mattered more than width, permanence, or aesthetics. Function came first, survival second, and comfort was rarely considered. The constraints were practical. Labor was limited. Skilled masons were in short supply. Timber and stone were expensive, and transporting them across rivers could be dangerous. Foundations had to be established on unstable banks, often in a hurry to reconnect disrupted trade routes. Narrow designs reduced the number of piers, minimizing risk of collapse and cost of construction. In many cases, a narrow bridge was simply the only feasible solution. Once a bridge was built, it rarely expanded. Modifying stonework was difficult and dangerous. Widening a bridge meant re-engineering piers, risking the structure during construction, and temporarily blocking traffic. Town councils often lacked the resources or will to attempt such undertakings. Instead, people adapted. Cart drivers learned to coordinate passing. Pedestrians gave way. Wagons were timed to cross in shifts. What began as a compromise became a habit. The narrowness of bridges had unexpected social effects. Control of the bridge became a point of authority. Toll collectors, guards, or local officials regulated passage, sometimes charging for safe transit. Merchants timed arrivals to avoid congestion. The rhythm of commerce was defined by a structure built in haste. Towns discovered that temporary emergency measures could shape daily life long after the crisis had passed. Bridges were often reinforced or repaired after floods, but repairs followed the original dimensions. Engineers might strengthen piers, replace worn decking, or add parapets, yet rarely widened the span. Doing so required extraordinary expense, advanced skill, and long-term planning. It was easier, safer, and cheaper to maintain the bridge as it was, even if it constrained movement. In this way, emergency fixes hardened into permanent limitations. Interestingly, these narrow bridges influenced the design of vehicles and carts. Wagons were built to fit the width of the crossings. Merchants selected pack animals that could navigate constricted spaces. Roads approaching the bridge were funneled, directing traffic in ways that reinforced the bridge's dimensions. What was an improvisation dictated engineering and commerce for generations. The phenomenon was repeated across Europe. Rivers were dotted with bridges that never widened. Some were centuries old, surviving wars, floods, and expanding populations. Travelers complained, merchants adapted, and local authorities occasionally debated reconstruction, but in most cases, tradition, cost, and habit preserved the original design. Emergency pragmatism had become expectation. Even the aesthetic perception of bridges shifted. Narrow, uneven spans were accepted as normal. A bridge that could carry only one cart at a time felt proper. Widening it would seem excessive or unnecessary. The emergency solution became the standard against which all bridges were measured. And yet, a question remains unresolved. When a temporary structure shapes daily life, commerce, and engineering for generations, who truly decides what is permanent? The builders, the rulers, or the habits of the people who adapt to it? Once a narrow bridge became part of a town's infrastructure, its influence extended far beyond mere crossing. You would notice the effects everywhere. Approaching roads funneled traffic, carts slowed to single file, and pedestrians instinctively moved to the edges. Life itself adapted to the bridge's constraints. What was built in haste became a framework for daily routine, commerce, and even social interaction. The narrow bridge shaped economic patterns. Merchants learned to time their arrivals to avoid congestion. Caravans coordinated schedules so that large wagons did not meet at the center of the span. Local markets adjusted opening hours to account for delays caused by crossings. A structure that was meant only to reconnect communities after a flood now dictated the rhythm of trade and labor. Emergency necessity had evolved into structural governance. Maintenance also reinforced permanence. Repairs were frequent because bridges faced constant strain from water, weather, and traffic. Each repair focused on preserving stability, not increasing width. Masons replaced stones carefully, following the original lines. Parapets were added for safety, arches were reinforced. But the span remained narrow. Altering the fundamental dimensions of the bridge was too risky and expensive, so the emergency design persisted. Social behaviors emerged around these structures. Tool collection became standard. Guards monitored access during busy periods or times of unrest. In some towns, regulations dictated which type of traffic could cross at which time: horses and carts in the morning, foot traffic in the afternoon. These rules were not emergencies anymore. They became habitual governance. People internalized the expectation that bridges constrained movement, and behavior adapted accordingly. The narrow design even influenced technology. Wagon builders and artisans constructed carts to fit the width of bridges. Axle lengths, wheel spans, and even the type of animals used were influenced by the constraints of medieval crossings. Roads approaching the bridge narrowed deliberately, reinforcing single-file traffic. A quick solution for a flooded river ended up dictating engineering standards for centuries. Psychologically, the narrow bridge shaped perception. Travelers accepted delay as normal, even natural. Crowding on a bridge was not frustrating. It was expected. Locals came to see the bridge as part of the town's identity, and any suggestion of widening it was often dismissed as unnecessary or wasteful. What had begun as an improvised fix became a social norm. Bridges also influenced urban planning. Town gates, streets, and markets were aligned to the bridge's dimensions. Flood defenses were integrated around existing piers rather than reconstructed entirely. Towns grew in patterns dictated by the width of emergency infrastructure. In this way, a single, hurried decision shaped urban geography for generations. Interestingly, narrow bridges could even shape local law and authority. Control of the crossing allowed toll collection, regulation of traffic, and management of disputes. Guards stationed at these points became enforcers of civic order. What began as a structural compromise became a mechanism of governance. And yet, despite centuries of use, narrow bridges were rarely replaced. They had become too central to social, economic, and legal systems. Expanding them would require not only resources, but also a willingness to disrupt a network that had grown around their limitations. Tradition and habit had hardened into permanence. Now, one unresolved thought remains. When an emergency solution becomes indispensable over generations, is it the solution itself that endures, or the web of habits, rules, and expectations built around it? By the later medieval period, the narrow bridge had become inseparable from town life. You would walk across it and notice the subtle ways it shaped society. Carts waiting patiently, pedestrians yielding instinctively, markets timed to the rhythm of crossings. What was originally a quick response to a flood or a destroyed ford had hardened into permanent infrastructure, governing movement, trade, and social behavior for generations. The bridge's narrowness reinforced authority and control. Toll collectors, guards, and officials managed access, ensuring both revenue and order. Local laws codified who could cross, and when, often prioritizing merchants or officials during peak hours, compliance was reinforced not only through enforcement but through habit. The townspeople had learned to coordinate their lives around the bridge's constraints. What was once a temporary compromise now served as a framework for law and governance. Economic life was intertwined with the bridge. Caravans scheduled travel around the bridge's capacity, and merchants built vehicles to fit its width. Goods were transferred efficiently because the limitations were predictable, not because the bridge had been designed for commerce. Roads approaching the bridge funneled traffic into single lines, shaping the flow of both people and goods. Emergency improvisation had dictated long-term trade patterns. Social behavior adapted as well. Travelers understood that waiting, queuing, and coordinating were necessary. Local residents internalized the bridge's limitations as part of everyday life. Even festivals or processions were timed around crossing schedules. The bridge, built in haste for survival, became a subtle teacher of patience, coordination, and compliance. Maintenance practices reinforced permanence. Repairs focused on preserving the original narrow span, rather than expanding it. Each restoration, whether after flood damage, structural wear, or fire, reproduced the original constraints. Parapets were strengthened, piers stabilized, and decking replaced, but the width remained fixed. The bridge's emergency design had become its defining feature. Interestingly, the narrow bridge influenced urban identity. It became a landmark, a symbol of the town's resilience, and a shared point of memory. Generations grew up crossing it, learning the rhythm of its traffic and the social expectations it imposed. It was no longer just a structure, it was an enduring element of civic culture. Even as technology advanced, narrow bridges persisted. Expanding them remained costly and disruptive. The town's routines, legal structures, and commerce had all grown around the original dimensions. Rebuilding would not merely widen a span, it would require reshaping the social and economic fabric itself. Tradition had solidified emergency pragmatism into permanence. From a modern perspective, this story highlights the hidden power of improvisation. What begins as a temporary fix, designed for survival, speed, and necessity, can endure far beyond its original purpose. Emergency measures quietly reshape society, infrastructure, and even human behavior. The narrow bridge stands as a reminder that survival strategies, once repeated and reinforced, can define the future in ways no one originally intended. And yet, the unresolved question lingers: when temporary solutions become embedded in daily life, is it human habit that preserves them, or the structures themselves that enforce habit? You are standing in a medieval town at midday, hearing the faint clatter of wooden wheels over cobblestones, and the occasional ring of a bell. Smoke curls lazily from chimneys, mingling with the smell of cooking fires and livestock. Fires are a constant threat, small at first, often unnoticed, but capable of consuming entire streets before anyone can respond. And yet, medieval towns had almost no formal firefighting system. What they did have were emergency improvisations that would shape urban planning for centuries. Fire was a daily danger. Buildings were crowded, constructed largely of timber, with thatched roofs that ignited easily. Open hearths were the norm. Candles, lamps, and braziers were used for lighting and heat. Sparks were inevitable. Even the simplest accident, a tipped kettle or a dropped ember, could ignite a blaze. Towns were densely packed, streets narrow, and winds unpredictable. The risk was constant. Early firefighting relied on immediate improvisation. Citizens formed bucket brigades, passing water from wells or rivers hand to hand to the growing flames. People yelled, beat on doors, and tore down nearby buildings to create fire breaks. There were no engines, no hoses, and no central command. Survival depended on speed, cooperation, and a bit of luck. What worked in one town might fail catastrophically in another. Bells became critical. Church bells, town bells, or specially designated fire bells rang to alert the population. Their sound spread faster than any human could, signaling everyone to drop what they were doing and join the fight. Bell ringing became both emergency alert and civic ritual. Residents learned to respond instantly, gathering buckets, axes, and ladders. The effectiveness of the response depended on communal memory. Everyone had to know the routine. Over time, temporary rules emerged. Certain households were responsible for maintaining buckets or ropes. Streets were cleared to allow brigades to move. Some towns marked water sources or created small cisterns for emergencies. These measures were never intended as permanent urban planning. They were simply responses to repeated crises. Yet, repeated crises led to habit, and habit hardened into expectation. The firefighting emergency also reshaped civic authority. Town councils began appointing watchmen responsible for detecting fires. Some were tasked with ringing bells, others with organizing the bucket brigades. Volunteerism became semi-structured. Accountability emerged. If a neighborhood failed to respond adequately, fines or social disapproval were imposed. What began as improvisation gradually became a rudimentary municipal system. Interestingly, the design of streets and buildings responded to fire risk, even unintentionally. Narrow streets were sometimes widened slightly to allow access for brigades. Open squares and courtyards were left as natural fire breaks. Stone walls were added where possible, and thatched roofs were replaced with tile in wealthier districts. Emergency measures influenced urban planning long before architects or engineers codified rules. Firefighting also shaped social cohesion. Residents depended on one another in moments of danger. Cooperation was a moral expectation. Failure to assist could result in ostracism, fines, or loss of trust. Communities internalized emergency behavior, and over generations it became a social norm rather than a temporary reaction. And yet, despite these adaptations, fires remained unpredictable and devastating. Towns never fully conquered the risk. Even as permanent measures, wider streets, cisterns, watchmen emerged, the improvisational spirit persisted. People learned to anticipate danger, not eliminate it. Survival became an art of preparation, habit, and collective memory. Now, one lingering thought remains. When temporary, improvised solutions become ingrained in daily life, do they shape the town's identity more than deliberate design ever could? Once the initial improvisations of firefighting became routine, towns began to incorporate them into daily life, transforming emergency measures into permanent urban practices. You would notice cisterns and wells strategically placed in courtyards, street widths subtly adjusted to allow brigades to pass, and bell towers maintained not merely for ceremonies, but to ensure every resident could hear warnings of danger. The emergency systems shaped the town's rhythm, its architecture, and its governance. Municipal authority increasingly codified responsibilities. Certain households were assigned permanent duties, maintaining buckets, ropes, or ladders, keeping access to wells clear, and monitoring the condition of nearby structures. Neighborhoods developed informal hierarchies to organize response, often coordinated by town watchmen. Compliance was expected, not only for survival, but for social order. Those who neglected duties risked fines, public reprimand, or loss of civic standing. What was once a temporary response became a rule reinforced by law and custom. The role of the bell grew central to the community's emergency culture. Bells were rung not only to alert residents to active fires, but to coordinate the movements of brigades. Their rhythms became predictable. A single ring summoned general attention, repeated tolling guided bucket lines, and sustained ringing directed evacuation. Citizens learned to respond instinctively, a behavior reinforced generation after generation. The bell's function transcended emergency. It became a tool for social cohesion. Architecture and urban planning adapted to these patterns. Streets leading to central squares were intentionally left clear, enabling brigades to maneuver efficiently. Buildings along narrow alleys were sometimes limited in height or reinforced with stone to reduce fire spread. Courtyards served as staging areas and temporary water reservoirs. What began as ad hoc solutions to repeated disasters inadvertently shaped the town's physical and social structure. Emergency improvisation had become a blueprint for survival and governance. Over time, the firefighting system influenced the town's economy. Merchants, aware of the risks, coordinated deliveries and market activity around emergency access routes. Construction practices shifted to accommodate safety measures. Timber usage declined where possible. Roofs were reinforced, and critical resources were stored in accessible locations. The cost of prevention became part of civic planning, integrating survival strategy into urban development. Social expectations hardened alongside physical adaptations. Residents internalized the emergency measures. Volunteering for bucket brigades, clearing streets, and responding to bell alerts were not optional, they were moral imperatives. Civic identity became entwined with participation in communal safety. Neglect or defiance risked social ostracism, demonstrating that fear-driven emergency measures could permanently influence behavior and norms. Interestingly, the system also encouraged knowledge accumulation. Experienced responders trained new recruits, perfected bucket lines, and developed improvisational strategies for different types of fires. This practical expertise persisted across generations. What was originally reactive and chaotic became methodical, structured, and predictable. laying the groundwork for more sophisticated approaches in the centuries to come. Despite all these adaptations, fire remained a constant threat. Even the most prepared towns faced devastation during particularly dry seasons or large-scale incidents. Permanent measures mitigated risk, but never eliminated it. Communities learned that survival depended as much on anticipation, memory, and cooperation as it did on structural planning. Now, one unresolved question lingers. When temporary improvisational solutions become embedded into urban planning, law, and social behavior, how much of the town's future is shaped by necessity rather than deliberate design? By the later medieval period, firefighting in towns had fully transitioned from improvised emergency response to an enduring system shaping urban life. Streets, buildings, and social behavior all reflected generations of adaptation to the threat of fire. You would no longer see bucket brigades as temporary. They were organized, with designated teams, assigned equipment, and schedules tied to the town's daily rhythms. Bells rang predictably, water sources were maintained, and citizens responded instinctively to alerts. What began as survival had become routine. Municipal authority formalized the system. Town councils appointed permanent watchmen to patrol streets, maintain equipment, and supervise brigades. Regulations codified responsibilities, schedules, and penalties. Civic participation was expected and socially reinforced. Volunteerism persisted, but with defined roles and accountability. Over time, fire preparedness became as central to governance as law enforcement or taxation. Emergency improvisation had solidified into bureaucracy. Urban planning itself reflected these lessons. Streets were designed or widened to allow brigades to maneuver efficiently. Open courtyards and squares served as staging areas or fire breaks. Buildings were constructed or retrofitted with stone foundations, tile roofs, and accessible water points. Even alleyways were strategically maintained to reduce flammability. The town's physical layout had been shaped by repeated crises, long after the original fires that inspired the adaptations had faded from memory. Social norms hardened alongside physical and administrative structures. Participation in firefighting was seen as a civic duty and moral expectation. Children were taught early to respond to bells, clear streets, and assist neighbors. Residents internalized cooperation as a habit, and failure to comply was socially unacceptable. What had begun as an emergency response had evolved into a defining aspect of community identity and moral responsibility. The accumulated knowledge of firefighting became a repository of practical expertise. Veteran brigadiers trained new generations in water transport, ladder placement, and fire containment techniques. Towns learned from experience which types of buildings burned fastest, which streets allowed effective passage, and how to coordinate large-scale responses. Over time, this knowledge laid the groundwork for more advanced fire management strategies in later centuries. Economically, fire preparedness became intertwined with town prosperity. Businesses timed deliveries, markets coordinated operations, and construction adapted to regulations that reflected fire safety. The presence of a well-maintained firefighting system reduced disruption and protected trade. What started as temporary survival measures now safeguarded wealth, stability, and the long-term viability of the community. And yet, despite these structured measures, fire remained an unpredictable and destructive force. Even the most prepared towns faced calamities, particularly during dry seasons, conflicts, or widespread neglect. The system mitigated risk but never eliminated it, teaching generations that survival depended on anticipation, coordination, and communal vigilance. As you reflect on this history, one thought remains unresolved. When emergency improvisations shape streets, buildings, social norms, and governance, are towns resilient because of careful design, or because centuries of repeated crisis have trained generations to survive almost instinctively? The line between necessity and tradition blurs, leaving the legacy of medieval firefighting woven into the fabric of urban life for centuries to come. You are walking through a bustling medieval market, the air thick with the smell of fresh bread, livestock, and occasionally spoiled food. Merchants shout over one another, customers haggle over prices, and guards move cautiously through the crowd. At first glance, it seems chaotic, yet there is an invisible order governing every transaction, every stall, every corner of the marketplace. That order is the legacy of emergency regulations that were never intended to last. Medieval markets were inherently unstable. Food scarcity, fluctuating harvests, sudden price spikes, and opportunistic fraud made daily life unpredictable. Town authorities, initially responding to panic, be it famine, hoarding, or suspected adulteration, began imposing rules. Weights and measures had to be exact. Prices were sometimes fixed, and scales had to be certified. These rules were reactive, designed to stabilize a market during crisis, but their effects would endure for centuries. The first regulations were crude, and often temporary. During years of poor harvest, town councils might appoint inspectors to check bread loaves or ale barrels, ensuring customers received fair quantity and quality. Merchants were fined for cheating, and disputes were mediated publicly. Compliance was demanded during emergencies, and failure could lead to social and legal consequences. But once the crisis passed, authorities found that leaving rules in place reduced confusion and conflict. What was meant to be temporary became habitual. Merchants and customers adapted quickly. Standardization of weights and measures simplified transactions. Buyers developed expectations about portion sizes and quality. Sellers adjusted production and packaging to comply with inspections. Over time, these practices were no longer seen as emergency measures but as necessary features of market life. Habits and infrastructure reinforced each other. Emergency regulation had morphed into tradition. The social impact was subtle but powerful. Market inspections and regulated transactions created trust between participants. Citizens felt that authorities protected them from fraud, while merchants learned that consistent practices prevented disputes and penalties. Compliance became a moral and civic expectation. Violators were not only legally punished but socially shamed, strengthening the permanence of rules originally imposed in moments of panic. Interestingly, infrastructure followed the rules. Market stalls were arranged for easier inspection. Streets were cleared to facilitate movement and prevent disputes over space. Storage facilities were standardized to maintain weight and quality checks. Physical space adapted to enforce rules, even though those spaces were initially improvised for temporary emergencies. The environment itself reinforced compliance. Economically, regulated markets stabilized commerce. Prices were predictable, supply was monitored, and the risk of conflict was reduced. Towns with established inspection routines could sustain larger populations and trade networks. Emergency rules designed to prevent collapse had inadvertently become tools of prosperity in urban organization. Markets that had once existed in chaos became centers of controlled, repeatable economic activity. Yet despite these adaptations, the underlying threat, scarcity, fraud, disease, never fully disappeared. Rules persisted because towns discovered they made daily life manageable. Citizens internalized expectations, merchants adhered to protocols, and inspectors became permanent positions. Temporary panic had given birth to enduring bureaucracy, codified in law, habit, and even architecture. Now one question lingers: when emergency regulations become so embedded that they define commerce, law, and social behavior, are towns thriving because of foresight, or because centuries of reacting to crises have created a self-perpetuating system that no one remembers was once a panic? As these market regulations became routine, their influence extended beyond crisis management into the daily rhythms of town life. You would notice how every transaction, from the purchase of bread to the sale of livestock, was subtly structured by rules that originated in moments of panic. Merchants adhered to exact weights, measures, and prices. Buyers expected fairness as a matter of course. What had been temporary safeguards evolved into permanent frameworks guiding economic and social behavior. Authorities formalized roles. Inspectors, originally appointed only during famines or suspected fraud, became permanent fixtures. They monitored stalls, certified scales, and adjudicated disputes. In some towns, records of inspections were maintained, creating rudimentary administrative archives. Compliance was enforced not merely with fines but with public accountability. Market participants quickly learned that adherence was not optional, it was essential to social and economic survival. The standardization of goods and practices had unexpected consequences. Over time, it encouraged specialization and efficiency. Bakers, butchers, and brewers developed methods that guaranteed consistency, enabling customers to trust both quantity and quality. Trade expanded because people were confident they would receive fair treatment. What began as emergency regulation became a driver of economic growth, showing how rules born of panic could have lasting structural benefits. Market design itself adapted to these regulations. Stalls were arranged to allow inspectors easy access. Streets leading to central squares were cleared to prevent congestion during busy market days. Storage areas were organized to maintain standard weights and prevent disputes over quantity. Even the physical layout of the town became aligned with procedures that originated in emergency responses, demonstrating how temporary fixes can shape long-term urban planning. Social behavior was similarly transformed. Citizens internalized expectations about fairness, honesty, and cooperation. Observing inspectors at work taught children and newcomers that compliance was a civic duty. Merchants built reputations around adherence to standards, while failure to comply could result in both fines and social ostracism. Emergency rules had hardened into moral as well as legal obligations. Interestingly, market rules also created a form of civic memory. Records of inspections, disputes, and penalties were shared across generations. New inspectors learned from predecessors. Practices that once seemed temporary were repeated until they became routine, codified in habit, law, and infrastructure. The market became not just a place of trade, but a living archive of practical governance. Even crises reinforced permanence. Years of poor harvests, plagues, or sudden price fluctuations prompted stricter enforcement, which in turn normalized rules. Citizens adapted to predictable oversight. What had begun as reactive control transformed into self-reinforcing expectation. Merchants and buyers conformed because the system had endured for decades, and compliance itself became survival strategy. Yet, despite the stability, uncertainty remained an ever-present background. Crops failed, diseases struck, and markets occasionally collapsed. Rules persisted not because they solved all problems, but because they offered a reliable framework to manage risk. Towns had discovered that emergency measures, repeated and codified, could guide everyday life far beyond the crises that inspired them. Now, one unresolved thought remains. When rules designed to control panic evolve into permanent systems of commerce, morality, and civic behavior, are towns thriving because of foresight, or because repeated crises left a cultural imprint too powerful to ignore? By the later medieval period, the market had become a carefully regulated environment, its order stemming not from planned foresight, but from centuries of reactive measures. You would notice the rhythm: merchants arranging goods according to standard measures, buyers weighing purchases with confidence, and inspectors moving predictably from stall to stall. What had once been a temporary response to panic was now embedded into the fabric of commerce, social behavior, and urban life. Inspectors had evolved into permanent civic officials. They maintained records, resolved disputes, and certified weights and measures. Their presence extended beyond emergency periods. They were integral to everyday operations. Compliance was enforced consistently, and citizens internalized it as a moral, as well as legal expectation. Participation and observance became normalized. The emergency procedures had become institutions. The physical environment reflected these norms. Market stalls were arranged for easy inspection and accessibility. Streets leading to central squares were cleared or widened to allow the flow of people and goods. Storage areas were organized to support standardization, and warehouses aligned with inspection routines. Architecture itself, bridges, gates, alleys, adapted to the procedural framework originally born of crisis. Emergency fixes had reshaped urban design. Economic patterns solidified around the regulations. Trade expanded with confidence in fair weights and quality. Merchants developed specialized practices to comply consistently. Buyers learned to trust markets as predictable environments, and even long-distance trade benefited from this reliability. What was initially a tool for survival had become a driver of prosperity. Social behavior, too, was shaped permanently. Civic identity intertwined with adherence to rules. Merchants built reputations on fairness. Citizens monitored one another, enforcing expectations informally. Children were taught from an early age to respect measures, observe norms, and participate in community oversight. Rules born of emergency had become moral codes, woven into daily life. The persistence of regulations was reinforced by repeated crises. Famines, plagues, and economic disruptions served to normalize enforcement. Each emergency response left behind lessons, routines, and bureaucratic structures that were carried forward, even in times of relative stability. Over time, no one remembered the original crises that had prompted these measures. The rules simply existed, unquestioned. From your modern perspective, this continuity is striking. Market fairness, civic oversight, and regulated trade, all taken for granted today, originated as temporary solutions to crises and emergencies. They survived not because of deliberate long-term planning, but because repetition, habit, and social enforcement transformed improvisation into permanent structure. As this story concludes, One thought lingers: when emergency measures outlast the crises that created them, shaping commerce, law, and social behavior for generations, are we witnessing the triumph of foresight, or the quiet persistence of survival instinct encoded into tradition?